All right, today we are going to dive deeper into the topic of multiband compression. In the last video, titled Multiband Compression Explained, I had hoped to get further into the problems that you can run into with the crossover frequencies causing phase issues. But the video was getting really long and I knew it was a topic all unto itself, so that's what we're doing today. Today I'm going to lay out some really common problems that these crossovers can cause, how to isolate them, how to listen for them, and what to do about them. And I guarantee you're going to want to watch this one all the way to the very end. I got a lot of goodies for you here. There's a lot of great information, so let's get right into this. So in the last video, I got to this hard rock crunchy guitar bus with these 4 guitars. Take a listen. Now, these 4 guitars are panned 1 hard left, 1 hard right, and the other 2 are about 3/4 left and right. And I pointed out that all of this is minimally processed just so we can hear the multiband compressors working and what they're doing. The only thing on all 4 of these guitar tracks is TDR Nova, which is doing no dynamics. All of them have the exact same high pass on them, 24 dB per octave slope at 70 Hertz. That's all that's on these guitar tracks. And they're running to the guitar bus, and we were taking a look at :MB by Analog Obsessions. When I turned this on, we had a terrible warbling effect going on in the stereo field. Bypass. Back on. And I pointed out that no matter how I changed the attack, release settings, and the crossover points, that the problem did not go away. Now, what I didn't get to point out is the problem did change audibly. When I messed with the low crossover filter and the attack and release settings, things did change a little bit, but it was still basically an unusable, destroyed sound. And I mentioned that it didn't sound like a phasing or chorusing effect, which is true. More on that in a second. And then I showed how TriComp on the same guitar bus was not having that problem. Take a listen. And regardless of whether or not I changed the attack to fast or slow and changed the release, TriComp was handling that bus pretty much just fine. So that was my conclusion. If one plugin is causing you problems, yank it, try another one. If the other one sounds good and there's no problems, then problem solved, just keep moving. In general, I do think that's pretty good advice when you're mixing, especially if you're mixing fast. And then later, if you have time and you want to, you can come back and analyze the problem. And there is a lot of great gems to take away from this particular problem, so this is what we're exploring today. Now, first things first, a mistake I made in the last video is the low to mid crossover frequency in :MB was set at 150 Hertz. When I switched over to TriComp, the TriComp was set at 250 Hertz. Now, that's a big difference. And I missed that in the last tutorial, so my apologies. But point being is that these crossovers, especially in the low frequencies, are where you get a lot of phase issues with multiband compression. The lower the frequency, the more you're prone to issues because of the nature of sound and the longer wavelengths that are going on down there. Now, a phase issue caused by a crossover filter in a multiband compressor or any multiband processing actually doesn't necessarily sound like the phasing that we might think of, especially for you guitarists out there. You probably think of something more like this. Here's a duplicate of one of those guitars with a phaser turned on. And technically that is phasing for sure, but when you're mixing, the kind of phasing that you need to be listening for is exactly the problem on this guitar bus when we turn on :MB. Let's listen to it again bypassed and then I'll turn it on. So that does not sound like a phaser effect, but it is the kind of phasing issue that is caused by multiband processing, especially these low frequency crossovers. And what that sounds like to me is some kind of comb filtering because of phase discorrelation happening. There's little moments in time where certain frequencies, primarily lower frequencies, are drifting into positions of being perfectly out of phase with those other frequencies, and they're canceling themselves out, which is why certain elements of the low end are dipping out and coming back and dipping out and coming back. That's what this sounds like to me. Listen to it again. And we can also hear it happening in the mids and in the highs, but most of it's in the lows. If I bypass the plugin and you just listen to the low frequencies, they're very solid. And when I bring it back on, they become very shoddy and spotty. So one possible conclusion here is that this low to mid crossover frequency is causing phase shift on the guitar bus. So then the question becomes, if I change the low to mid crossover frequency on :MB here up to 250, where it was in TriComp, does the problem go away? And no, it absolutely does not. If anything, it gets worse. Now let's change TriComp's low to mid crossover frequency from 250 down to 150, where the :MB's was. So now we're hearing a tiny bit of that phase shift effect coming out of TriComp, but nothing as pronounced as we were getting from :MB. And in case you're wondering, if I again at 150 adjust the attack and release settings, the end result is TriComp is still handling whatever the source of this problem is way better than :MB is. Now both TriComp and :MB have the same crossover frequencies set. They're at 150 and 5K on both of them. So let's take a look at a correlation meter. Here's our spectrum analyzer. This is Span from Voxengo, and I have a whole tutorial on this. And down here on the bottom right is a correlation meter. So whether or not you're hearing a phase issue, you can always use a correlation meter because sometimes it can point out things that your ears might be missing. In this case, we're totally hearing a phase issue. But first, I want to see it with all of the effects turned off on the guitar bus. So there's no multi-band compression going on, and let's take a look. Now you can see there's a little bit of dip to the left of the 0 mark. When the meter dips to the left, it's indicating a phase shift issue. Let's keep watching this meter as I turn on :MB, and we'll see if that gets worse. And it is getting worse. Now let's compare that to TriComp. And the meter is showing that TriComp is handling the problem better, but we still don't know what the problem is, do we? Right now, the spectrum analyzer is listening to the entire spectrum, so I want to show you a great little trick for trying to isolate frequencies for your spectrum analyzer. The low-mid frequency band, everything from 175 hertz down. And I have this on the master bus ahead of the spectrum analyzer. So now the spectrum analyzer will only be listening to everything from 175 and below. That way we can look at our correlation meter just in these low frequencies. The crossover on isolate is slightly above the 150 crossover on the multiband compressors, just to make sure that we're hearing a little bit on either side of the crossover. I don't want to set them exactly the same. Let's take a listen again to the guitar bus with no multiband compression on. Now the phase issues are way more noticeable in the correlation meter. It's exactly as we expected. The lower frequencies are prone to the problems, so we have quite a bit of phase issue going on. Now let's go ahead and turn all of those EQs off on the 4 guitars. So now there's no high-pass filtering going on. And you can see that the phase issues are a little better, but they're definitely still there. So one of the first things that we can deduce is that the high-pass filters on the guitar tracks are making the phase issues a little bit worse. And I'm going to come back to this. So for now, let's leave all those high-pass filters off and just try to figure out what's going on with the crossover filter on the multiband compressor. And let's turn on :MB. Interesting. The phase issues on the meter are not showing to be that much worse. They're a little different, so let's turn isolate off and see if it still sounds the same. And it does. We still have the issue that we can hear. With :MB bypassed. Yeah, back on. Yeah, especially if you're on headphones, you can really hear this issue between the left and the right. We have phase discorrelation going on. There's phase shifts happening. Now let's compare to With isolate back on, the phase issues are pretty much the same, nothing dramatic. So far what have we learned? The high-pass filters on the individual guitar tracks were making things slightly worse, which means that they are creating a little bit of their own phase shift, which is very common with high-pass filters and low frequencies. Now, in the past, I have said that I use these steep 24 dB per octave slope high-pass filters in Nova, and I don't get any problems. And that's true. What's happening here is I'm using 4 of them on 4 different tracks that are all going to the same bus. These high-pass filters here, they're still multiband filters. An EQ still is a multiband processing, and whenever we're applying filters to low frequencies, we are prone to causing phase issues. So my first tip here, we can simply turn on the exact same high-pass setting on the bus itself. Then I only need 1 instance of the EQ to do all of the high-pass filtering, and it's way more efficient on the CPU, and it's way less prone to causing phase issues because I'm only doing it once. And we can see in the correlation meter that we have a little bit of the phase issue going on. Let's bypass Nova. And we can see that the phase issue has pretty much not changed. Nova's really not doing anything now to the phase issue. So that's solution number 1. When you're dealing with the bus, always do your high passing on the bus if you can. And now some of you might be saying, hey, what about linear phase EQs? That's also a topic for a different video. But here's my point about TDR Nova. The algorithms are fantastic, and even with the steep 24 dB per octave slope at as low as 70 Hertz, it doesn't typically cause me a problem unless I stack a whole bunch of them up on instruments that are headed to a bus. But back to the topic at hand, which is that crossover filter in the multiband compressor. So the other thing that we've been able to conclude so far by using isolate and just listening to the bus without any multiband on is that these guitars in of themselves in the recording have phase issues. It's just not very pronounced, so it doesn't really bother us when we listen to the entire bus. But when we isolate out just the low frequencies, we can really see it pop up in the correlation meter, so we know that the phase issue is coming from the low frequencies on these guitars. And then when we turn on :MB, this low frequency crossover is making the problem a lot worse. Let's take a listen again. Yeah, that's dreadful. And TriComp, with the same crossover settings, is doing great. Now, is TriComp actually doing a better job than :MB? Or is it more that they're changing the envelope in different ways? In my mind, that's most likely the case. So the existing phase issues in these guitars are being accentuated by :MB, but they're really not being accentuated by TriComp. Part of what's going on here is the different way that the different compressors are changing the envelope. Now, the next logical thing for us to check is going to be flipping the phase polarity on these individual guitar channels. So if I change the phase on this first guitar, which is panned hard left, we'll watch the correlation meter and we'll listen with our ears and see if anything gets worse or gets rectified. Yeah, that's clearly worse. Next one. We have a whole new kind of phase issue going on. There's different timings in the frequency cancellation that's happening with the comb filtering. We still have a problem. It's not being solved by flipping the polarity on any of these guitars. And in case you're wondering, I have flipped the polarity on all 4 of these tracks in every possible combination, and the problem is still there. Flipping the phase polarity is a super useful tool, and a lot of times that simple act will fix your problem. But in this case, it doesn't. So we still have a phase shift going on in the original guitars, but a little tiny bit of phase shift is not necessarily a deal breaker. If it's not distracting to the listener, then what's the problem? A little bit of phase shift is not the end of the world, but we don't want to do this with :MB and make the problem 10 times worse. That's awful. It's ruining the guitars. But TriComp is doing great. We still get a great multiband compression on the guitar bus. If it doesn't bother you, then it's fine. Let it be. A lot of great mixes that we know and love have tiny bits of phase shift problems going on somewhere in there, but it's not enough to be a problem. And those are the big takeaways here is A, always trust your ears. If you're not hearing a problem that's ruining your mix, then don't worry about it, but you also need to know what to listen for. So having the correlation meter, the spectrum analyzer, the ability to isolate the frequencies, and knowing that your potential problems are those crossover filters, and even those high-pass filters, you need to know all of these things so you can hear the problem in the first place. And as far as this problem goes, we still haven't found the root cause, and we still haven't fixed it. And here's the icing on the cake. The real root cause of the phase shift in these guitars has been staring us in the face the entire time. Did you catch it? Now, if you did, congrats. And if you didn't, don't feel bad. We're all students here when it comes to mixing, and we're always learning. And a lot of times the problem and solution are right in front of our face, and we just missed it. Now, in the first video, what I pointed out is when I dropped this into mono with :MB on, the problem went away. Now, did you see it? Let me take it out of mono. So the spectrum analyzer is in mid-side mode. The yellow and green are mid and side, and all of that pink stuff poking up is the spectrum analyzer's warning bell going off, showing us that we have side information creeping up over the mid information. And there's the rub. The entire problem all along was that these 4 guitars were recorded with too much side information down in the low frequencies. So here I have a parametric EQ with a low shelf set to only the side channels. Now watch the spectrum analyzer as I turn it on. Bam. Did you see the correlation meter? Let me bypass the EQ. There's all of our phase issues. Turn it back on. Phase issue resolved. That was the problem all along. And turn on TriComp, no problem at all. So now with TriComp set at the low to mid crossover frequency of 150, we don't hear any problem at all, completely resolved by turning on the parametric with the low shelf taking out the side information. Do the crossovers on the multiband compressors cause phase shift? Yes, they do. Is it necessarily the end of the world? Absolutely not. Is a little bit of phase shift in your mix a big deal? Well, only if it's a big deal. Is it distracting? Is it ruining something? Is it changing the experience for the listener? And most importantly, just because you're having an issue with the multiband compressor crossover filter doesn't necessarily mean that that filter is the entire root cause of the problem. It could just be accentuating a pre-existing problem. So I hope you got a lot out of that. And stay tuned for a video where I get more into the nature of phase shift and minimum phase versus linear phase and latency. I'm going to try to get to all of that in the next video. But let me know what you think down in the comments, and I'll catch you on the next one.